Historic records prove the secret intensification of the biological weapons race in America make the Soviet efforts pale by comparison. Here to prove it are three of the most stunning and condemning documents in biological warfare history. First is a never declassified congressional record of 1969 showing the Department of Defense requested $10 million to develop, quote, synthetic biological agents for germ warfare, end quote, through the National Academy of Sciences, National Research Council, that is, the NAS-NRC. That's nearly half of the amount of money given to all of biological weaponry that year. These new laboratory creations were descriptively and functionally identical to HIV/AIDS. Mind you, this was 15 years before the contested discovery of the AIDS virus by this man, Dr. Robert Gallo, who, as you will see in a minute, oversaw Litton Bionetics, the Army's sixth leading biological weapons contractor at that time. Bionetics also operated the entire administration of the National Cancer Institute's programs at Fort Detrick at that time as well. This private company was a medical subsidiary of the mega military weapons contractor called Litton Industries. Litton's president, Roy Ashe, was Nixon's alternate for the National Security Advisor post he gave to Kissinger. In consolation, the president made Ashe his White House chief of American business and industry. As Roy Ashe was joining the Nixon White House staff, Kissinger ordered Admiral Zumwalt of the Navy to do a reassessment of America's biological weapons capabilities. The Navy has always been at the forefront of such things. Bioweapons were cheaper to make and could be made to target certain people, even certain ethnic groups. There is no doubt that Fort Detrick's sudden cancer focus was part of a greater depopulation plan. According to congressional records and his biographer, Time magazine's managing editor, Walter Isaacson, Kissinger selected the option presented by Admiral Zumwalt to develop AIDS-like and Ebola-like bioweapons, and the contract went to his White House colleague's company, Litton Bionetics. There is now no doubt that Dr. Gallo officiated the development of these AIDS complex viruses. His group at Bionetics combined leukemia, lymphoma, and sarcoma viruses from various species of animals nearly 15 years before he was credited by the Department of Health and Human Services for having discovered the cause of AIDS, a similar retrovirus. They said this would lead to a cure, an AIDS vaccine within 3 years. It never happened. I managed to catch up to Dr. Gallo at the 11th International Conference on AIDS in Vancouver in 1997. I asked him if he was concerned that some of his experiments might have given rise to the AIDS virus or AIDS virus relatives that might have contaminated monkeys and chimpanzees shipped by Litton to the Merck's vaccine division in New York for the production of the earliest hepatitis B vaccines.
To start a more substantive discussion. There's an amazing do-gooder called Julius Rosenwald, and some of you may be familiar with him, but basically he made his money in Sears and Roebuck country, money in that company. He was a Jewish immigrant to the United States, and he had a soft spot in his heart for underdogs. There was no greater underdog in the United States than African Americans at the time that he was looking for a source for his chronic do-goodism. Most of his money in the Julius Rosenwald Fund went into building rural schools in the South, which began to try to address the separate but equal schools that didn't exist for African American children, or existed in such paltry form they were pitiful. But he also was enamored of the role that the medical division of the Rockefeller Foundation had played in public health. So he decided in the late 1920s to open his own division of health, albeit in a very modest way. He didn't have Rockefeller's money. So what he did was to hire a pioneering medical sociologist / economist, a guy named Michael M. Davis. And some of you may know his name because he was head of the dispensary movement in Boston and its efforts to bring low-cost health care to blue-collar workers. And he, too, was a chronic do-gooder. If you know the history of public health, he was behind every effort to get national health insurance, starting with the first effort in the Progressive Era. And there would be 8 more before, quote, Obamacare, end quote. He's a chronic figure who just recurs, and he's always on the right side with my sense of what's right about getting health care for people who don't have health insurance. So his problem, when Rosenwald tapped him to create this new division in the Rosenwald Fund, his problem was that he didn't know anything about black health. He knew a hell of a lot about the Irish in Boston, but he didn't know much about African Americans. So he did something pretty smart. He made an overture to the United States Public Health Service and asked them to loan him an advisor, an officer, who was conversant with black health issues. And the person who wound up being seconded to the Rosenwald Fund was a gentleman named Tolliver Clark. And Tolliver Clark, as luck would have it, was the director of the Division of Venereal Diseases of the United States Public Health Service. The U.S. Public Health Service at this time was organized around disease models. Okay, it had a tuberculosis division, it had different specialty and workforces built around different illnesses. And what was amazing about the organization was its esprit de corps. Despite the fact that they were fighting a very strong headwind with private medicine that didn't want much public health presence, they managed to do a lot of good with very few resources. And they had, within their divisions, enormous esprit de corps. And part of their esprit de corps was always their conceit that whatever disease they worked on was the most important. It energized them, and they would tell you to the person that what we're doing is God's work. So Tolliver Clark was a true believer in the transcendental importance of VD and its threat to American health. So riding on the wake of what had been the social hygiene movement, which introduced Americans to discussing prostitution, venereal disease, vice commissions, and reforming the American discourse so that you could talk about sex in polite society, riding that wave, they were able to get some pretty good funding for public health work in VD control. So when Tolliver Clark slides over to the Rosenwald Fund as this advisor, he tells Michael M. Davis that if you've got some money and you want to get the most bang for your buck, what you should do is go into syphilis control for African Americans in the rural South, because it is a large health issue and it's not being addressed. And moreover, if you do good work in that area, he was able to point out a number of benefits that would follow. So armed with the Rockefeller, or not Rockefeller, but Rosenwald Fund dollars, they chose 6 different states, each of which presented a different demographic profile of the African American community in those states. And they went into those areas, first of all, with a Wasserman dragnet, and they tested select populations to get incidence figures to see how much infection or what the rate of infection they were looking at. The second part of the program, having ascertained the infection rate, was to go back in basically and treat and confront head-on the notion that African Americans would not cooperate with treatment. I think I just turned off my deal. But would instead be bad patients. So with these 6 different, with these 6 different southern communities, I'll give you the bookends. At one end was Albemarle County, the home of the University of Virginia. At the other end was Macon County, the home of the Tuskegee Institute. In Albemarle, Virginia, they, with the population they tested, which was a pretty good random selection, they found a syphilis rate of 5% of the people they tested. That compared not unfavorably with national estimates of syphilis in the general population. In Macon County, Alabama, at the other end of the continuum, they found an infection rate of 35%. 35% of tested were syphilitic. But of that 35%, they also ascertained through clinical examination and case histories that 62% of that 35% figure, more than half, had congenital syphilis. So the disease had become endemic, and it was one of many diseases that had really lost its venereal quality. You could have found equally high infection rates of tuberculosis and pellagra and other chronic issues. And the reason was that the level of poverty, just think of Macon County as a rural slum, and you've got pretty close to the mark. The income was paltry, the diet was pellagrous. People went from cradle to grave and never saw a physician. It was a group that lived outside of modern medicine. So the second part of this program, after getting the baseline data on infection, was to go in with mobile clinics and do treatment using what were then the treatments of choice, the arsenicals, arsvastatin, neoarsvastatin, mercury by inunction. And those treatments are toxic. They take a good clinician. You have to gauge the patient's tolerance, but there's no question that they kill spirochetes. It is efficacious treatment. In fact, in the history of medicine, the first specific treatment for a germ-caused disease that's effective is salvarsan, Paul Ehrlich's magic bullet, discovered early in the 20th century. So they go in with mobile clinics and they have remarkable cure rates. And they get these cure rates by using techniques of modern epidemiology. They have follow-up workers, they bring the people in for treatment, and they sort of confront head-on the racial stereotypes that you can't treat African Americans because they won't complete the course of therapy. It's a matter of resources. It's a matter of getting the boots on the ground and getting the work done. So they publish articles in the state medical journals. There's a great kind of buzz about the importance of these 6 syphilis control demonstrations. Everyone's self-congratulatory. And the hope is that the state budgets, of these southern states or the legislators will kind of get inspired and maybe appropriate a little money for public health work. Instead, this pioneering experiment has the singular disadvantage to go forward at the exact time that the Great Depression is getting darker and darker. And the money that the Rosenwald Fund was able to put into its do-good projects was always tied to the stock market value of Rosenwald, or of the Sears and Roebuck stock. And as that declined with the Depression, the Rosenwald Fund trimmed its sails. And they basically did away with the medical division. They all but closed it. And instead, they went back to their first love, which was building rural schools for black children. So at this point, you have the background of what becomes the Tuskegee study. Here's what happens. Tolliver Clark, who's the guy seconded and does the advising and puts together these demonstrations, has a bee in his bonnet. And the bee in his bonnet is that he wants to go back to Tuskegee and study the effects of untreated syphilis in black males.
In 1932, the United States Public Health Service launched the most shameful, hideous, and longest non-therapeutic experiment on human beings in medical history. The practitioners of the infamous Tuskegee syphilis experiment promised free medical care to over 400 African American and desperately poor sharecroppers in Macon County, Alabama. This wicked study was designed to document the progression of syphilis in black men. White scientists had long claimed that the disease manifested itself differently in blacks than in whites. Scientists decided to document this by finding a pool of infected black men, withholding treatment from them, and then charting the progression of symptoms and disorders as these men suffered in pain, eventually falling into insanity and dying. Now ain't that a bitch? The sad part is, a handful of African American healthcare providers actually worked with these sadists in order to mislead the test subjects for their continued compliance, as documented in this 1997 film, Miss Evers' Boys, starring Alfre Woodard and Lawrence Fishburne.
going!
No, Willie.
Not, come on, Willie. You can't be thinking like that. Let me work on these legs.
Now, listen, what you do is you drink your quart of that low tea. At the beginning of the month, you'll be just fine. The double fly stepping in no time at all. Yes, he will.
He needs some new doctor.
What you doing in that costume?
Ain't no costume, it's a uniform.
You join the army.
Figure it's my war just like it is theirs. I know what you thinking, nurse. You wanna know how I got in? With bad blood, huh? Got me one of them penicillin shots. Get one of them in you, that Wasserman test don't show nothing bad. Army couldn't wait to take a fine specimen like me.
You just gonna get yourself killed.
At least I get killed for something.
Ah!
That's what he need, one of them penicillin shots.
He's getting the best of care.
At no time were the men ever told that they had syphilis. Instead, they were told they had something called bad blood. By the 1940s, validation of penicillin as an effective cure for the disease was known, and still the experiment continued. Even in 1947, when penicillin had become the standard treatment for syphilis, the suffering of these black men and their families continued under the strict direction of the United States Public Health Service. The tally of those who suffered was nothing less than scandalous. By the end of the study, only 74 test subjects were alive. 28 of the original 400 had died of syphilis. Another 100 were dead from related complications. And over 40 of the wives had been infected, and 19 of their children were born with congenital syphilis. The Tuskegee syphilis experiment lasted 40 years, finally ending in 1972 after being exposed by reporter Jean Heller, when, in the Washington Evening Star newspaper, she ran this headline on the front page: "Syphilis patients died untreated." With those words, one of America's most notorious medical studies became public and soon after came to an end. On May 16, 1997, former President Bill Clinton issued a public apology at a news conference in Washington, D.C. One of the speakers at the conference was then director of the Center of Disease Control, Dr. David Satcher.
Protect the public's health. Today is an historic event. As our President acknowledges the tragedy of the U.S. Public Health Service syphilis study in Tuskegee, and apologizes on behalf of the government for decisions made many years ago that still haunt us, we open a new chapter in public health. The U.S. public health study of untreated syphilis in the Negro male was wrong for many reasons. The study participants were never informed about the purpose of the study, never asked to give their informed consent to participate in the study, and were intentionally misled about receiving treatment.